This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Duell. Today we're learning about the glorious trumpet from Josh Whitehouse of Milano Music in Phoenix, Arizona. We'll talk about the history of the instrument, differences between beginning instruments and step-up instruments, mouthpiece choices, and so much more. Josh Whitehouse, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
This is going to be one of my favorite episodes, being a trumpet player myself, and I know you're a very passionate player as well, so we're going to learn all sorts of interesting things about the trumpet today. But I'm going to take the role of the curious host who knows nothing about trumpets. So we're going to dig into the basics, and by the end of this, Ed Reps will know all sorts of great information about trumpets. So let's dig into you first, Josh.
Okay.
What's your story? Where do you work? Where are you from? All that.
Well, right now I work at Milano Music. I am the financial controller there and the buyer and the webmaster and a number of other things. It seems I always make the joke that it's really easy to gain a job, but it's really hard to lose one sometimes. In terms of how I got here, I mean, I started probably how a lot of other people start. I started in fifth grade band. Picked the trumpet because my father played one as a kid, so that sounded like something that he'd be able to help me with if I needed. Turned out he hadn't played in probably 20 or so years at that point, but went through public school. I decided in high school that I really wanted to be a trumpet player, or at least give it a try. So took lessons with a couple of really good teachers and took some auditions for conservatories and wound up going to Eastman School of Music for the first couple of years of college, and had the opportunity to transfer to the Curtis Institute of Music after that. It's a pretty small school, and the best part at the time is that it was completely tuition free. So,
wow.
For someone trying to take student loans and things like that, that's certainly an advantage.
Right.
Got done with that, went to the University of Maine to do my master's. And then after I got done with that, my teacher retired, and they decided that they wanted to keep me on. And so they hired me it started as a lecturer of trumpet. And I also taught music theory and eventually became an assistant professor. But at a certain point, I was 29 years old and had a master's degree, and I was living in Maine, which, while is a wonderful place to vacation, sometimes is a little bit of a difficult place to work. There's not a lot of playing opportunities, and I really wanted to play, professionally. So I came to Arizona to study with Dave Hickman at Arizona State University.
Yeah, great teacher.
Yeah, and then after a couple of years of that, decided that not working is something. Unfortunately, that's hard to pay the rent that way. So I had to get a job. I got a couple of different positions, and then wound up there was an opening at Milano Music for an ed rep. And I actually got kind of recruited by Chuck Kerrigan, who's, of course, very well.
Good friend of ours.
Yep. And I had been playing in brass quintet with him for a number of years at that point. So started as an ed rep. Then my boss retired in 2014, and I started to become the buyer and manage and do a few other things. Then our accountant left us. Unfortunately, he had a heart attack and passed away during the pandemic, and so I had to learn how to do that stuff as well. So that's kind of a short answer to a long journey. But here I am.
You've seen a lot from playing, teaching, and all aspects of retail, haven't you?
I have. I've definitely got a pretty wide range and experience on these instruments.
Yeah, no kidding. I also know that you've sold many, 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 many trumpets over your time there at Milano Music, and a real guru of the instrument.
That used to be what I would do. I'd get done repping, and I'd try to get back to the store by about 2 o'clock, and usually would meet customers. And that was really the fun part of the job for me, was selling, especially the high end horns.
Mm,
Being kind of
yeah.
a gear junkie myself.
Good. Good. Perfect guy to talk to then. We like gear junkies. All right. So let's dig into the trumpets a little bit. And I'd like to start, as we do with a lot of these 101 level instrument sessions at Rep Radio, a little bit about the history of the instrument. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the trumpet has been around in various forms for, well, it's right at about 4,000 years actually.
Whoa.
Yeah, it goes back. I mean, they found silver and gold trumpets in King Tut's tomb. Actually, there were various forms of it that weren't metal. They used to use seashells. They've used animal horns as trumpets. The shofar being one
Hmm.
that's still used in religious ceremonies. And it sort of evolved over time. I mean, I think over the first probably 3,500 years, there wasn't a lot of evolution. It was started as what a lot of times what people refer to as the natural trumpet, but it was a non-valved, non-keyed instrument, and they could just play the overtone series. And
Hmm.
at a certain point, people got really skilled on some of the higher overtones, and this is during the Baroque and the Rococo period. We're talking late 1600s, early 1700s, and there was a you see all those really high trumpet parts that people struggle with these days on the modern horns.
Hmm. Right.
Um, then there was varying attempts at making the instrument chromatic. They wanted to, rather than just being able to play a scale, kind of out of tune scale at that. They used keys for a while, like the Haydn trumpet concerto was one of the first things that was composed for a keyed trumpet.
Hmm.
They had slide trumpets in the English part of the Baroque period and a couple other places as well. And then they eventually wound up with valves. And valves, different designs happened during the 1800s, and then that kind of got more standardized to what we're dealing with these days, which is the piston valve trumpet that we all know and love.
Mm. Mm. Okay. So like the mid 1800s or so, the modern trumpet, I guess you could say,
Yeah, it
is
became more through the cornets actually. You'll see
okay.
like your even Civil War instruments from the 1860s and then slightly later that
Hmm.
are basically the same kind of valves that we have now. Yeah, and those got
Okay.
transferred over to trumpets a little bit later than that, and then it really took off when they started composing jazz. It became primarily the trumpet kind of took over from the cornet at that point.
Okay. Okay. I do want to ask a little bit more about cornets
Hmm.
versus trumpets. You see both out there. What's the story there?
Well, the cornet, like I said, is a little bit of an older instrument in terms of the bands. The biggest difference is the construction. The trumpet has a lot more cylindrical tubing than the cornet does. The cornet has more conical tubing, so the bore expands, more gradually, gives it a little bit more of a mellow sound. And it used to be up until the mid 1900s, they would start most kids on cornets. And in bands you'd
Hmm.
actually have a cornet section and a trumpet section. If you see like old Sousa marches and things like that, they'll
Hmm.
have both. And the whole thing kind of just got pushed together now. Like even if you have cornet parts in an orchestra, most people are playing trumpets on them.
Okay. Interesting. So, I started in the 1990 on cornet, and you just don't see that much anymore. Do you see cornets out there in beginning bands, or is it pretty much
Not
just
very
all
often. I
trumpets?
mean, we would when we would do our rental season, we've got thousands of trumpets in the rental pool, and we have some cornets, and for there was a couple of band directors that insisted that their kids started on cornets, so we've got a few dozen of them. But
Hmm.
for the last few years, I don't remember ever taking one to a rental night for kids to start
Yeah.
on. Sometimes people think that it's a little bit easier to play, it gives a little bit quicker response, a little bit more mellow sound, and it's also for a small kid, it's easier for them to hold, because
Hmm.
the valve section is not going to be as far away from their face. So I can see the benefits
Yeah.
of it, but it seems like most days, most people are just starting everybody on trumpet.
Yeah. Yeah. We see that as a maker too. We
Sure.
hardly ever get orders for cornets anymore. It's all trumpet, trumpet, trumpet. So, just before we leave this topic, cornet versus trumpet, what's the basic sound difference you think?
I would say a little bit. The cornet's a little bit more diffuse sounding, and the trumpet is a little bit brighter. That would be.
Okay.
It's kind of hard to describe sound with words, but
Mm,
that's
right.
sort of how I would think of them.
Yeah. All right. Trumpet's a little brighter, cornet's a little
Yeah.
mellower. Oh, okay. All right. Is there any downside to starting in a cornet versus trumpet?
Um,
Let's say you're a small kid and it's just easier to
Not
hold.
that I
Any
can think
downside?
of. No.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're gonna basically for the rest of this, we'll just stick on trumpets. But I wanted to make sure we did throw out the cornets there since they're still kind of.
Yeah, I love
Uh,
cornets, by the way. I mean, I put a whole album of cornet solos out there. That's my solo album
oh,
is mostly cornet. So yeah,
awesome! I'll check that out. Yeah, yeah, and of course, British brass bands still
absolutely.
play
Hmm.
cornets, and no trumpets at all. So I guess it's kind of a regional preference.
Hmm.
Hmm. So an interesting thing. So you sometimes you see music majors or orchestra players or professional trumpet players. They come to a gig, they come to a rehearsal, and they've got this backpack with 5 trumpets in it, not just one. So I kind of like to go into what are the most common trumpets? What is the first trumpet anybody should own, and then what are the other ones that as someone grows as a trumpet player, they should consider getting, and stores should consider stocking.
Well, the most popular trumpet by far is the B flat trumpet, and that's pretty much what everyone starts on. I've heard of people starting on other instruments, but I've never actually seen it anywhere that I've worked.
Hmm.
And the B flat, that's the instrument that they use in jazz. It's the instrument that's used in bands. 98% of the time, that's what you're going to need. So that's usually the first trumpet people buy, and you should also be the first upgrade when you get to a nicer instrument. It's a B flat. After that, the C trumpet is probably the next most common. That's mostly used in orchestras, and that's actually, when I'm gigging, that's primarily what I play is a C trumpet, just because I'm more used to
Hmm.
that than I am the B flat. I'll warm up on the B flat, but I'll tend to perform on the C.
Okay.
Um,
Why is that?
well, the B flat's a little harder to play, honestly, for me. It's
Hmm.
to get the articulations and response. It's a slightly smaller bore than most C trumpets, which I'm sure we'll wind up talking about that later.
Bore
But
size.
yeah,
Yep. Yep.
so for me, it's if I can play it on the B flat, I can definitely play it on the C.
I
And
see.
the C tends
Okay.
to project a little bit better. It's a little bit bigger sound, so when you're trying to keep up with the trombone section, that the C trumpet helps a little bit.
Okay. So a C trumpet, I know the tubing is a little shorter versus a B
Hmm.
flat. How does that affect the feel of the playability between the two?
Um, if you have someone who's been playing a B flat for a long time, and and you hand them a C trumpet, and they're gonna struggle a little bit, because where you feel the open partials are, obviously it's a whole step higher
Hmm.
for that. For me, just because I'm used to it, I find it slightly easier to play with a nice big clear sound on a C than I do on a B flat.
Okay. Okay.
But I think your
It's
mileage
interesting.
may vary. Everyone's a little bit different.
Sure. It's interesting. You go into most music stores and there isn't a C trumpet on the wall.
At
Should there be?
smaller stores, that's probably the case. I know we have an entire row of them at our store, but we've
Mm,
also got a lot of trumpets. So
you
yeah,
do. Beautiful wall of
yep,
trumpets and in a great market for it too. Even in those medium or smaller size markets, do you think it's worth having a C trumpet?
I do. You'll find, even if someone's not playing in a professional symphony orchestra, a lot of times trumpet players are asked to play at church services and things like that. And the C trumpet,
Mm,
you know, beyond just not having to transpose when you're reading keyboard music or anything like that, it's just that sound projects. It's a clear sound. And I know a lot of people who don't play in orchestras, but they do use it for various gigs.
mm. Okay. Okay. So B flat's number one, C's number two. What's next? What's the next most popular trumpet to have?
It depends on what kind of music you're playing. If you're a classical player, it's going to definitely be a piccolo trumpet.
Hmm.
After that, if you skew more towards jazz, it's going to probably be a flugelhorn,
Yeah. Okay.
which is not really a trumpet, but it's in the family. So
Right. Right. And it's something that many trumpet players, I wouldn't say most, but many trumpet players own, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, actually, it's funny. I don't own one right now, and I've got about 25 other instruments. But
Well, good thing you work at a store. You can borrow one
yeah,
anytime.
exactly. Yeah, there's a brand that I like that's I'm waiting for them to get theirs done.
Yeah, someday,
Yeah.
someday. So, let's go back to the piccolo trumpet for a
Sure.
second. Then I want to move on to the flugelhorn. So, what's the use of a piccolo trumpet?
Piccolo trumpet facilitates the high register a lot easier. It's kind of a myth. People think that as soon as you play it, you can play an octave higher. I
Hmm.
wish that was the case, but most people's range is just about the same on any instrument they play. It's just the partials are going to be further apart, and so you're not going to be missing as many notes. Number one, and then
Hmm.
number two, because the length of the tubing's shorter, the bore size is usually also smaller. It's got a much brighter sound.
Mm. And you have to be a pretty developed player, right,
You
to
do.
really do well on a
Yeah,
piccolo.
every once in a while, I'll see a high school kid, playing it, and I always kinda wonder about that. I mean, I didn't play one of those
Mm.
until I was in college. Not to say that a high school player can't, but, you wanna make sure you got your mechanics pretty well down before you start messing around with that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So the flugelhorn,
Mhm.
uh, where would you see that used? And what's it all about? It's a funny word, even.
Yeah, well, um, a much more it's even more conical than the cornet, that we talked about.
Mm,
It's pretty much a straight cone the whole way through, except for the
mm,
valve section. They're smaller bore usually. Um, you could have, a medium large trumpet might be 459. A small bore French flugelhorn might be 412. So it's
okay,
quite a bit smaller. Doesn't necessarily feel that way just because the bell's so big and it opens up so gradually. It's a really warm, mellow sound. It's primarily a double for anybody who's going to be playing in a jazz band.
okay,
But you do see them in brass bands. Every once in a while, you'll see it in an orchestral piece, but it's usually when they're playing pops or something like that.
okay. So in a school setting, usually it's jazz band?
Usually jazz band. Yeah, I mean, it's rare probably for a high school musician to own one, but a lot of times the school will have a set. And if
Mm,
they don't, it's they should at least have one or two, so that when you got a soloist out front, they can you can get that sort of a sound.
yeah, yeah. As a retailer, do you see area schools typically buying them and owning them for the school?
Sometimes it depends on the school. A
Okay,
lot of times that's sort of down their list. They've got to make sure they have bass clarinets and tubas and French horns and
sure.
things like that first. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, high schools occasionally, definitely colleges. We sell a lot of those to colleges. So
Okay. Good to know. Is that something that you think a store should just kind of special order, or is it worth having on the wall?
we have about we usually have 6 or 7 of them in stock,
Wow.
ranging from. I mean, they'll have the student models of everything, right? So they have student flugelhorns
Mhm.
all the way up to your $4,000 flugelhorn, which unless you're playing a lot, that's going to be hard to make that money back.
Yeah. As a professional, you mean?
Right, as a professional
Yeah,
musician, yeah.
makes sense. Okay. So, all right. So B flat, C, piccolo, flugelhorn.
E
What else?
E flat D would be the next one after that.
Okay.
That's kind of I call it a tweener horn. It's not really a big horn. It's not really a small one. Um, People primarily get it to play the Haydn and the Hummel trumpet concerto. That's where you first wind up experiencing in
Mm,
E flat. But brass quintets, we've got certain pieces that if I'm going, there's one gig, but every time I go to it, I may have to make sure I have an E flat in the bag because there's one piece
mm.
they always request, and that's what it lays best on.
Okay. Okay.
So
Is this again kind of for the more advanced player?
yeah, I mean, I think that I had messed around with one in high school. I mean, it's less of a transition to play an E flat from a B flat than it is to go say to a piccolo.
Mm,
That's a much more difficult transition to make.
okay.
So, but definitely by college. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
even if you can't own, having owning 4 professional instruments when you're in college is pretty tough.
It's a lot of
B
money.
flat, C,
It adds
E
up.
flat, and piccolo. I mean, that's quite a bit of cheddar, as they say.
Right. Right. And the bassoon players listening are like, oh,
I
come
know.
on.
Yeah, well, my wife's a violinist, and she'll,
Oh,
that's the price of one of her bows. So,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. it is interesting how many different instruments a serious trumpet player can own. So I wanted to go over all those various ones
Hmm.
that are kind of out there. But obviously, for the ed rep in the school setting, let's focus on the B flat
Sure.
trumpets. The ones that are 99% of what they work with. And let's dig into you'd mentioned kind of beginner trumpets and different levels. So let's dig into the one that ed reps probably work with the most, the beginner trumpet.
Hmm.
So what kind of qualities do you find in a beginner trumpet? And can you kind of describe why a trumpet would be classified as a beginner trumpet?
Well, they are typically two-piece bells. I mean, the biggest difference between, I mean, a trumpet is a trumpet to a certain extent.
Hmm.
In terms of construction, there are some less expensive methods that you can use. There are some less expensive materials that you can use. So a lot of times, the difference between a beginner trumpet and a professional instrument might be the way the bell is formed. For instance, it might be
Hmm.
the tolerances of the actual tubing that they're using. It might be the manner in which the valves are constructed, that sort of thing. You just in general fit and finish are going to be better on a pro horn. But when you're getting a beginner trumpet, there's no reason that it shouldn't be a quality instrument as well. You want
Hmm.
to the biggest thing that ed reps are going to see, and I don't even have to say this, is that you'll see some of these you recognize the brand, some of them you don't. You know, and
Sure.
some of the ones that are marketed by, well, let's just say major retailers that aren't necessarily music stores. I mean, you can
Hmm.
get a trumpet for $150. You can do it, but you get
Hmm.
what you pay for, unfortunately. So people ask, they come into our store sometimes and they look at the retail prices of even just a student trumpet, and they're like, why is it so much? I was like, well, you know, try that one for 6 months and then try this for 6 months, and I think you'll know. It's
Hmm.
there is quite a difference in quality.
Yeah. Staying on that topic, because it does come up a lot. There's a lot of really, shall we say, very low priced
Yep.
instruments that are very tempting for parents out there versus what most music stores carry. What do those students experience? What can you tell parents who are shopping and need that really solid information as to why?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing that I tell people is, in terms of durability and things like that. I mean, as when I was an ed rep, I'd go out there and somebody would hand me, some pink colored trumpet or something like that that was
Hmm.
obviously, bought for $100 or something like that, and they say this needs repair. Well, you can't repair it because you can't get parts. Number one,
Hmm.
the metal might be too soft to work on. The valves might be pitted. I mean, there are things that are going to degrade very quickly, and so sometimes at, say, a rental night, well, no, someone will be looking at our rental plan and they're saying, well, I can just get one off of blah blah blah.com for $120. I just say, well, I'll see you in 6 months, and
Hmm.
that's usually what happens.
Right. Right. So I'm sure you've played these
Hmm.
not so wonderful instruments. What do you feel like when you play a good quality student instrument versus a really low price one, really cheap one? What do you feel?
Well, biggest difference is on a good quality student instrument, you're going to have basically the same blowing resistance no matter where you are on the horn. If you're in the low register, the high register, whether you've got no valves
Hmm.
pushed down, two valves pushed down, on a lower quality instrument, there could be air leaking through the valve section. There could be pinches in the bore. And so
Hmm.
it's going to feel, I mean, generally they feel more resistant as a rule. But then there's also going to be a great deal of variability. And so the kid who's, I mean, let's face it, playing a trumpet is hard enough as it is with a good instrument. If you give them a
Hmm.
bad one, they're not going to have a good experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Seems true across all the instruments,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
absolutely.
Hmm. Okay. So I'm going to go back to something you mentioned about a two-piece bell.
Hmm.
Um, what do you mean?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to make trumpet bells. The two-piece bell is, and this is, you'll see this with most student instruments, and actually even some professional instruments do this. They rather than that bell all coming from one piece of metal, they will stamp a flare out, with a metal stamping machine, and then they will take the bell tail, what we call the part that comes out of the valve section and curves around up to a certain point. They can just put that on a lathe and widen it out so that it meets where they're going to stamp, where the end of the stamped part of the bell is, and then they'll braze that, and that will become. That's the two-piece bell. On a one-piece bell, it's a single sheet of metal that is
Hmm.
uh, basically they join it, notch it, and braze it. It looks almost like a flower, at a when they, before they get ready, and then they will put it on
Hmm.
a lathe. They'll turn it, hand hammer it most of the time, and basically they'll form the bell that way. So it winds up looking the same shape, but it's just two
Hmm.
different ways of getting there. Obviously, the one piece bell is a lot more time consuming and requires a much greater skill in terms of the manufacturing.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Having watched the manufacturing process quite a few times on different types of bell, you would think that one piece would be easier, but actually, uh, to make it right and really good, one piece bells are actually a little harder
Quite a bit harder,
to
yeah.
really do well.
Hmm.
Whereas two piece bells, basically the very end, the biggest part of the flare at the very end of the bell, that's its own little piece,
Hmm.
and then we solder them together, and so it's a little easier, faster than doing it one way. That's a question I get sometimes. Like, well, if it's two pieces, why is it less money? Well, that's why.
Right.
One's harder.
Yeah. Most of the cost of any of these instruments is labor.
Yep. Yep. So true. So, what else about a good quality beginner trumpet is separating it from a professional trumpet?
Um, well, the valves themselves is usually a big one. A lot of times, professional instruments are made with Monel valves. That's what the majority of the instrument industry uses for higher level valves. Which is Monel is kind of a porous material. It's a very hard material, but it also can absorb oil, and so it
Mm,
works really well for valves. There are stainless steel valves out there as well, and that's you'll see them in beginner instruments, you'll see them in pro instruments, depending on what company it is,
mm,
and those can be really good as well. And there's one company that I know that uses nickel plated valves. That's another way of doing it.
mm.
But in general, whether it's going to be a student instrument or a professional instrument, the biggest difference is going to be the tolerances on the valves themselves. How close is the side of that valve to the actual valve casing?
Okay.
You want it enough so it's going to get a good seal. And it's sealed with that with the oil in there, so that you've got a continuous air column. You don't want it to be
No
a
leaks.
bumpy ride. You don't want it to be out of alignment. Much like a car valve is the same sort of thing.
Mm,
Um, Aside from that, lead pipe materials can make a difference. There are some companies that will do things like they'll use a different alloy in their lead pipes than they would in the rest of the horn.
mm. Yeah, you
Um,
do see that quite often.
yeah,
What do you see, and why do they do that?
I think that there's two different reasons that I've been told for that, and one of them is that if you use a brass alloy that's got more copper in it, it is more resistant to red rot.
Hmm. Okay.
Which, if you've ever seen an old trumpet that looks like the lacquer's kind of flaking off in little pieces that are on the lead pipe itself, and sometimes you'll see
Mhm.
dark marks there. That's
Mhm.
what red rot is. Is it's the actual zinc leaching out of the brass itself,
Mm.
and it causes deposits on the inside of the lead pipe, and just generally, it's not a good thing for a trumpet or any kind of brass horn. So by using more copper alloy, I've been told that resists that some. There was also a school of thought that it's going to be a warmer sound if you use more copper in the metal.
Okay. Okay. So quite often you'll see gold brass
Hmm.
lead pipes, which is what you're referring to. Which kind of brings up, if someone hasn't listened to any of the other brass instrument 101 level up episodes yet, what in the world is brass? Let's just go to that level for a second. What is brass made of?
It's copper and zinc primarily. I mean, there's traces of other things in there as well, but I mean, I think, and boy, someone's going to nail me on the numbers here, but yellow brass, I believe, is 70/30 zinc and copper.
Okay, so like 70% copper, 30% zinc is
Yellow brass,
yellow
yeah.
brass. Okay,
And the
okay,
more zinc that you have and the less copper, it's going to be a slightly harder metal. So if you use
okay,
more copper in there, it's softer. The idea is it's going to be a warmer sound.
okay,
They
okay.
they mess around with this more with trombones than they do with trumpets.
Right, right. So the bells, we were just talking about two piece or one piece. What kind of brass do trumpets typically have making those bells?
Typically, it's yellow brass. Um,
Okay,
yeah, it's a 70/30. You can have there's a lot of makers that have options for gold brass. Um, Back in the day, there used to be, well, I think there's still a couple companies that do it, but just straight copper. I mean,
Mm,
that's a repairman's dream probably, but just in terms of how
easy
soft
to
it would be.
take a dent out, but also put an easy to put a dent in.
Exactly. That plus a gig
Yeah.
bag would be bad.
Yeah, right. I'll throw out there that gold brass is typically 85, kind of the industry standard is 85% copper, 15% zinc. So yeah, yellow brass has the lowest amount of copper typically, and then gold brass is next, and then you have like rose brass and then red brass. So more and more copper. But yeah, it is interesting. You see trombones messing around with different types of brass way more in the bells than you do trumpets, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one thing that you always notice is student trumpets or beginner trumpets, as some like to call it. They're all that brass color
Hmm.
and not silver. Why is that?
Mostly price. You know, when you
Okay.
start silver plating things, you're usually adding at least $100 on the
Hmm.
price tag. Also, it's just they're faster to manufacture. The brass ones. I mean, it's basically they're usually using a spray lacquer on the
Okay.
brass, and they're easy to keep clean. You can basically take some pledge and just spray a bell and wipe everything right off of it. It comes perfectly clean.
Pledge.
Yeah,
So it's lemony fresh.
exactly. That's what they use in our repair shop. Honestly,
That's awesome.
whereas with a silver horn, it takes a little bit more care.
Mm.
You got to polish it. Silver polish cloth and all that kind of stuff. Start seeing more silver horns when it gets to be intermediate and pro. More people want that option.
Mm. Okay. Okay. So the student horns being in lacquer
Hmm.
is more about price and ease of maintenance.
Pretty much. Yep.
So I remember in band, everybody talked about getting their silver trumpet.
Hmm.
Their silver trumpet. They can't wait to get their silver trumpet. So, what is it with silver trumpets? I mean, they look different than the lacquer, but what's the benefit of getting
They're
silver
just way
over
cooler, man.
lacquer? Of course.
No, primarily, I mean, I remember the exact same thing. I got my first silver trumpet when I was a freshman in high school, and I mean,
Hmm,
it definitely stands out. I mean, the silver trumpets really weren't much of a thing until like the 1950s or 60s.
hmm.
I remember that the teacher that I studied with at the University of Maine, he used to play in the Chicago Symphony under Fritz Reiner.
Wow.
And when he was there, the way he tells the story is that the Vienna trumpet section or the Vienna Philharmonic came and played at Orchestra Hall in Chicago, and the
Hmm,
trumpets they were playing silver billed trumpets. So Fritz Reiner, said, well, we have to have those too. And so you hear about
hmm.
like the Chicago Sea trumpets that are
Yeah.
that are real famed. That's
Right.
where they originated.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah,
So, what was it about the sound of a silver trumpet that was so alluring?
I don't think it had much to do with anything, to be honest with you. I think it had to do with it
Really?
with appearance.
They're pretty.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people will say that lacquer is warmer, silver's brighter.
Okay.
I wouldn't have believed that, having played lacquer and silver trumpets quite a bit, until I got my first gold-plated instrument, and then I
Hmm.
noticed, okay, wait a minute, there is something to this. That it was definitely a warmer sound. I had two of exactly the same trumpets. One of them was silver plate, the other one was gold plate. Same specs, and there was a difference. I think that there was more of a difference back when they had different types of lacquer. They used to use a baked
Hmm.
on lacquer rather than a spray on lacquer. Now lacquer is a lot thinner than it used to be.
Hmm. Okay.
So I think now it's
Yeah.
primarily visual.
Okay. Speaking of lacquer, I know a lot of student horns use epoxy lacquer,
Hmm.
that baked on stuff that's more durable, will survive acid baths or chemical baths more.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
and the spray stuff. I mean, and even on professional instruments, it's lacquer's a temporary thing. It's gonna come off
mhm.
at some point.
Yep. Yep. And then the brass underneath gets all dark and patinaed and
Yep.
yeah. And some people strip it all off, right? To
So
get a raw brass trumpet.
some people
What's
want
that
that
all
look.
about?
They think there's again, some people think it does something different to the sound. I mean, we're talking microns here. I don't
Mm.
think it makes a big difference personally.
Hmm.
It's
Okay.
but it does look different.
It does. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. So, of course, silver being a precious metal, it costs money
Sure.
to play down there, but it does look like it's a more durable, right? To the silver stays on more
Yeah, I mean,
versus
I play
lacquer.
silver trumpets, and the reason that I do is because if you have any kind of acidity in your hand, it's going to eat right through the lacquer. And
Mm,
so if you see a silver trumpet that's 10 years old versus a lacquer trumpet that's 10 years old, the lacquer trumpet is definitely going to show the wear more. The
Mm,
lacquer's going to come off. You're going to have hand not really hand prints, but it'll rub into where the brass is. So some of the brass will be patinaed, some of it won't be. And on a
mhm,
silver, it
mhm.
tends to maintain the same finish over
Yeah.
the whole
Have you
instrument.
seen have you seen in your shop there, people who've eaten through silver because they have just a certain chemistry in their hands?
Yeah, a lot of teenage kids actually. It's funny. I used to eat through silver myself. My
Hmm.
first professional horn that I had was silver plated, and I went right through the silver on the valve section. You could see exactly where my hand was on the
Mhm.
instrument. I I think it has something to do with I don't know if it's the food that they eat. I don't. It doesn't happen to me anymore. And it hasn't
Interesting.
since since I was in my 20s. But as a
Interesting.
teenager, yeah, it was the body chemistry was a little bit different. Maybe more
Yeah.
acid. Maybe I was eating too much junk food. Who knows?
Same thing happened on my trumpet. It was actually kind of concerning. I'm like, wow, I'm eating through this finish into the brass. I'm
Hmm.
like, what in the world? But it happens, and you see it on like silver plated keys on
Yep.
clarinets. You see it on silver flutes. I mean, it's just a thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, and you can get it replated. What I tell most people is that if you have acidic sweat like that, just get a hand guard. Get
Mm,
one of those leather hand guards to wrap around the instrument. That's just going to protect the finish a lot more.
yeah. Good idea. So another thing we've talked about a little bit here is bore size.
Mhm.
Uh, so what is a bore, and what are we talking about?
The bore is the width of the tubing, and it's usually measured in the valve section. Um, different parts of the horn are conical, different parts are cylindrical, but all the tubing that's within the valve section pretty much has to be one bore size. So that's
Okay.
where you take a measurement. What most people do is they pull out the second valve and take calipers and measure the inside of that, and that's what the actual bore of the horn is considered.
Okay.
Um, the industry standard is either usually 0.459 inches or 0.460 inches, depending on who you're talking to.
Okay.
Although with some beginner horns, notably Eastman with that 221 that you guys have, you have a
Mhm.
medium bore student horn as well.
Yeah. So what's that bore size? I mean, I know, but I'm just testing
Well,
you.
I think it's 454. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I got lucky.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a little bit
So
smaller.
what
You wouldn't think that 5 thousandths of an inch would make a difference, but I mean, it really does quite a bit.
mm, yeah, it feels really remarkably easy to play.
It does. If you've got smaller kids that they don't have a real strong embouchure yet, they're not really used to putting a lot of air through the instrument, then you will find a medium bore horn will respond a little bit quicker. I grew up on a medium large horn, so I mean, you certainly as a student can play those without any issue. But it's nice to
Mhm.
have that as an option.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's something, I hope, honestly, it catches on, especially for, like, 4th and 5th grade
Hmm.
bands, where they're just physically smaller and they're just not developed well.
Sure,
It just seems so much easier for
gives
them
them a little
to
bit more to lean against. Yep.
exactly, make sound comes out easier, they don't have to press so hard. It really is a help. It's kind of like, why we give beginners in trombone land a small bore trombone, it just makes it easier.
Right. Yeah, if you hand a beginner a 547 bore, they're gonna be falling into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So most student trumpets being medium large bore, 0.459 and 0.460. So what about a professional trumpet?
Professional trumpets are usually medium large as well.
Okay.
I would say 95% of the pro level horns that we sell are 459. You can get them in different sizes. You can go either smaller or larger. Most times, if it's a classical player, they're used to a large bore C trumpet, which is 462 for the
Hmm.
bore size, and they think, well, I should have my B flat match that. I'm like, okay, here's one to try. And within a half an hour, usually they're coming back going, I think I'm going to go back to the medium large. Just a
Huh.
little less work.
Yeah. Yeah. So the bigger it gets, the harder work it is.
So yeah, I mean, you gotta. It's just like anything else. You got to fill that thing up with air, and it's not going to
Hmm.
give you as much resistance. So you got to be working your chops a little bit harder too.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not just the bore size that makes a horn play more open, but it is a big contributing factor.
Okay. So what's really interesting is, in certain instruments in the band, when you look at a beginning instrument and then you look at the whatever you want to call them, performance instruments or step up instruments or professional instruments, when you look at differences between the two different levels, a lot of times it's really
Hmm.
obvious as to, like a plastic clarinet versus a wood clarinet
Right.
or a closed hole flute or an open hole flute. It doesn't look that obvious on paper for a trumpet. So, I mean, it's the same bore size, right? Three valves, all this stuff. So, what really changes between a beginner trumpet and we'll just call it professional trumpet?
Well, the biggest difference is just the ease of playing and the way the horn projects. Those are the two number one things you'll notice when you pick up a nicer horn. How well the instrument plays in tune with itself.
Hmm.
There's a lot more care in the design and a lot more tweaking that goes on in a professional instrument than something that's being mass produced for students.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, but to a certain point, you are right. A trumpet is a trumpet. I mean, I could pick up a student trumpet and I could probably go play a brass quintet gig on it and be fine. I don't think that
Hmm.
anybody would notice, except that they might notice it was a lacquer horn.
Sure.
But
Sure.
for for a trumpet player who's been playing a long time, and you want to get the best instrument you can, the best one you can afford. And fortunately, with a trumpet, that's not too hard. I mean, people come into our store and they'll see the $4,000 trumpets, but really that's the best trumpet in the world, in my opinion.
Hmm.
you know
Hmm.
Whereas you're not even getting started when it comes to some woodwinds at that price, and
Oh,
string
yeah.
instruments, forget about it.
Right. Right. Like you said, that's the bow.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, you've played all the trumpets out there in every level of instrument. What do you feel when you play a beginner trumpet and a professional
I
trumpet?
feel more resistance on a beginner trumpet. It
Okay.
definitely feels like it's a little harder for me to get the sound out of the thing, and it depends. I mean, there's some beginner trumpets feel relatively close
Hmm.
to a professional horn. It's not as good, but it might be 80% of the way there.
Okay.
But like I said, intonation, that's a big thing. Flexibility, being able to get from one part of your range to the other on a better instrument, that's going to be easier.
Okay.
And so just overall, it's just you pick up a nice professional instrument and start playing, and it feels like the instrument's not getting in your way.
Hmm. Okay. It just kind of feels like a part of you and you are able to make more music without struggling.
On a good day, yeah.
On a good day. Yeah, one would hope. Yeah. So something you mentioned on the beginner trumpets is a two-piece bell,
Hmm.
and we talked a bit about the one-piece bell. What do you typically find on most professional trumpets?
One piece bell. And
One piece.
that's not to say 100% of the pro trumpets. I know a few brands that, and actually some very expensive trumpets that still come with two-piece bells. But
Hmm.
I mean, it's all going to be a very personal thing to me. I feel like the one-piece bells ring better. Um,
Ring better?
yeah, when you're transmitting the sound through the instrument, the actual instrument's vibrating, and I
Hmm.
find that with a one-piece bell, it's a freer vibration. It doesn't feel like you're pushing the instrument quite so hard
Okay. Okay.
physically to get it to ring.
Okay. What about like the shape of the sound, the width of the sound, one piece versus two piece? Can you feel a difference? Can you hear a difference as an audience member?
The biggest thing that I notice in terms of sound is going to be upper harmonics. I'm
Hmm.
going to hear a lot of more highs in the sound on a one piece bell in general.
Okay. A little more
A little
brilliance
bit
in
more
tone.
brilliant, yeah. And I've
Okay.
actually found that on listening to trombone players too.
Hmm.
A two piece bell, it's a different kind of sound. Just where if you were to look on it on a scope, I think on a one piece bell you hear more highs.
Hmm.
Just my opinion on
Hmm.
that.
Okay. Interesting. I've heard some people compare one piece versus two piece bells. If you know those old mag lights where you could change the beam of the light
Hmm.
flashlight to a floodlight to a
Hmm.
spotlight. I've heard some people call a two piece bell more of a spotlight, like it's more
Okay.
directional, more straight out, and some people call the one piece bell more of like a floodlight, like it just fills the room a little bit differently, a little wider.
I noticed that
Did you
with
hear that?
I don't notice that much with the actual bells themselves. I mean, to be honest
Mm.
with you, I don't play anything that's a two-piece bell myself right now, so I'd have to pick one up and experience it. I notice it. I definitely notice what you're talking about with different materials, though. The more copper that
Mm.
you get in the alloy and the bell, it tends to broaden the sound out. It tends to spread a little bit more.
Okay, interesting. So let's say you're a junior high trumpet player, and you've been playing for X amount of years. When do you know that you should get a better trumpet? When do you know you've outgrown that beginner one?
Well, if you're taking it seriously, if you're taking private lessons, if you're trying to do anything competitive, like get into regionals or all state or anything like that, certainly a better
Mhm.
instrument is going to give you a leg up on that. It's also going to it's going to be easier to play, so you won't struggle on the basic sound production as much as you would
Hmm.
on a student instrument. Again, we kind of mentioned this before, but one of the nice things about trumpets is that you don't have to go that much more expensive to really get a nicer instrument.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
not like
No, not compared to flutes.
yeah, you don't need a car loan,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. So sometimes I'll have people ask about what trumpets are good for jazz or what trumpets are good for classical.
hmm
What are your thoughts on that?
To a certain extent, a trumpet's a trumpet. You'll find
Hmm.
classical and jazz players. You take um, there's the Bach 37. That's kind of a standard amongst professional trumpets. I know classical players who play them and jazz players who play the exact same horn.
Hmm.
You can get a little bit more variation. Usually, classical trumpet is just down the middle. You don't want anything that's going to stand out. You want something that's going to be able to sound like everything, not something that's going to get its sound pigeonholed into one thing. Whereas
Hmm.
with jazz, sometimes people want a very very mellow sounding horn. Um,
Okay.
so something with a large bell, more copper in the brass alloy. It's going to take a lot of the highs out of the sound, but it'll give it a little bit more of that smoky, intimate sort of sound that people are looking for.
Hmm.
In terms of
Hmm.
students, you just want a good trumpet. I mean, a lot of those effects, if you're a good enough musician, they can be achieved with, um, yourself, but you can also change mouthpieces. You can add mutes. There's other things that you can do to get those sort of sounds. You know, Very rarely will you find somebody in high school who needs, their jazz trumpet and their classical trumpet. That's
Okay.
Yeah, they more need their marching band trumpet and their regular trumpet, the
Right.
beater,
Right.
and then the one that you don't want to be knocking around on the field.
Right. Totally agree. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess jazz is a really broad
hmm
genre. You have various styles within it, but one that sticks out is the lead trumpet.
Okay,
The one who wants to play higher, louder, faster
sure.
in jazz band. Any thoughts on equipment for that for trumpet, or is it just again just a trumpet's a trumpet?
Well, lighter weight horns tend to. I mean, when you're looking for that sort of a sound, you're wanting something that's got a lot of highs in the sound, um, and just like it sort of pierces through the jazz band. It carries above everything. So a lighter weight horn can help with that. A lighter weight bell, and most makers have that as an option that you can get. It's just going to be a thinner gauge of brass they're using to form the bell. Um,
Hmm.
in terms of other equipment, I mean, the biggest difference when you're doing that kind of playing is going to be the mouthpiece. You're going to go from what most people use in band, which is a C cup mouthpiece or just kind of a medium bowl, to something that's much more shallow. And
Hmm.
that's going to create more resistance. It's going to just allow them to get a little bit more access to the upper register. That being said, you're not going to. It doesn't usually. It's not going to give you high register that you don't already have. It's just going to facilitate
Hmm.
the use a little bit easier, and you won't have to work quite so hard for that bright sound.
Okay. So good technique comes first, and then equipment will help from there.
Yeah, but if you've got a kid who's in high school, as somebody who's in junior high looking for their lead mouthpiece, I think that's way too early for that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But if you've got a strong player who's already got pretty decent fundamentals in high school, and they've got the jazz band chart has got some notes that are kind of on the edge of their comfort, it might be time to look for something. Um,
Hmm.
you don't want to go too extreme. Usually we want to work with a teacher or at least with a professional who knows what they're talking about. I wind up
Yeah.
with all these kids wind up with these really shallow mouthpieces with really tight backbores, and it's number one, it doesn't sound good, and then number two, it's it doesn't play in tune. They're chipping
Hmm.
notes left and right. It's too extreme for their playing level.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that. So the topic of mouthpieces is the bottomless rabbit hole
Yes,
that we could go down. But let's just offer a couple of suggestions to ed reps about beginning mouthpiece, and then what's the next kind of a couple of suggestions for people who want to upgrade their mouthpiece after a couple of years.
sure. I mean, I think most kids will either start with a 7C or a 5C. I think 7C is probably by far, at least where I'm at, that's the most common mouthpiece that you're going to hand a beginner. I
Okay.
personally I started on a 5C. There's not a huge difference between the two. It's just a little bit different shape. After that, um, when kids have got a stronger embouchure, you usually want to go to something that's a little bit wider diameter. The 3C is a really popular choice. I think when I graduated from high school, I was just on the verge of playing a 1.5C, which is now starting to get a little bit bigger.
Mm.
But commercial players, they're not going to want to get that big. They're going to want to go, have their, maybe they wind up with a 3C as their band mouthpiece, their concert band mouthpiece, but they're going to want something else that, like we talked about with the lead mouthpiece, that gives them a little bit more access to their upper register.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, if you start on a 7C, you could go to a 5C, you could go straight to a 3C. It's nice if the way we have it set up at Milano's, we have just racks and racks of mouthpieces, so they
Mm.
can come in, try whatever you want. We'll disinfect everything, of course, and put it back. But they want to try to find something that they're comfortable with, that they could play on for 20 minutes or so. And you don't really know for the first couple notes whether it's going to be a good mouthpiece or not. But
Mm.
after playing 15 or 20 minutes, your lips swell up a little bit. You start to realize, is this something I can be able to play on for an hour or not? You know,
Mm. What are you getting when you change mouthpieces? What's it changing?
changing. It's usually there's a number of different measurements. Are you talking about just physically?
Yeah, I guess physically in sound and feel for the player.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing is the rim shape. You want something that not everybody's teeth is the same. Just the same way that
Mm.
I have a hard time wearing Nike sneakers. They make my little toe go to sleep. They don't fit my foot. But New Balance feels great. And certain companies will have different rim shapes, and some of them are going to feel great on you. Um, that's the most important thing. After that, you want a cup, generally a C cup. Is that's kind of the middle of the road cup. It sounds, when you hear trumpet players playing, that's the sound that you're have in your head most of the time, is that
Mm.
sort of a cup. You get more shallow, it's going to be brighter. You get deeper, it's going to take the highs out of the sound. Um, some other things that you can do is, and this is more advanced, but it'd be altering the throat and the backbore of a mouthpiece. That's probably something an ed rep's never going to have to run into. But
Sure.
when
Yeah.
orchestral players, that's a pretty common thing for them to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I do hope someday to do a whole episode on mouthpieces where we can just go down that
Oh,
rabbit
you could
hole
do a 10
because
part series probably if you
it's
wanted.
endless. It's endless. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So, does valve oil make a difference? The type of valve oil you use, or is it all the same?
Well, it definitely does make a difference, and there's two basic types. There is a petroleum based oil, and then a synthetic oil. Petroleum
Okay.
based oil. When I was growing up, that's all we had. We had
Mm.
the most popular one was Alcas, which is still being made today. It's a
Mhm.
petroleum oil, and the biggest difference between petroleum and synthetic is that petroleum will break down a lot more easily. So when
Okay.
you take some valves out of a trumpet and you see like black either on the valves or on the bottom of the valve caps, a lot of time that's oil. I mean, that's the actual
Mm.
oil that from the valve oil that started to separate.
Okay. You
Where
mean like the crude oil
yeah,
is separating it out of the petroleum?
pretty
Huh.
much.
Interesting.
And then with a synthetic oil, it holds together much better. I mean, it's a completely different animal. The same way people use them in cars. If you have a high mileage
Hmm.
car, or if you have a really I don't know, cars that are more expensive than what I drive, then a lot of times people will make sure that they use synthetic oils to keep the engines in really great shape.
Okay. Do you think it's worth the extra few dollars for the synthetic?
Yeah, I mean, and it's usually not even. It sometimes isn't even that. I mean, you could get one for six
Hmm.
dollars and the other for $8. We're not talking. And a bottle of valve oil lasts a long time, and especially if it's a synthetic. I know that the brand of oil that I use, they changed the bottle, like the actual physical bottle.
Hmm.
I still have a bottle of the one before they changed it, and this was probably 2 or 3 years ago.
Wow.
So it lasts. I mean, I have got more than one bottle of valve oil, but my point is that it lasts a very long time.
So it's worth the extra $2 and it lasts you 3
And it
years.
keeps your horn cleaner too. You know, you
Yeah. Yeah. It feels different, doesn't it? Different valve oils
it
actually.
does. And then you also wind up. There are certain people that have a problem with certain formulas too. Like I
Hmm.
know I have a professional player that I played a lot with. That I recommended him, the valve oil that I use, and then his valves started turning yellow. And
Huh.
they had this kind of a real sluggish feel to them. Clean the horn, reapply the valve oil, same thing happened. And it wasn't the horn, and it wasn't really the oil, but it was the way that his body chemistry mixed with that oil. So we
Interesting.
switched him to a different brand, no problem.
Wow.
And I've heard it more than once, so it wasn't just a freak thing. So you got
Huh.
to find a valve oil that works for you.
It's actually your body chemistry.
Yeah,
It's very personal. Okay,
absolutely.
interesting. Huh. So what are we missing, Josh? What did we not talk about yet that we should cover for trumpets?
Oh boy. Well, one of the things I was thinking about is that you have your ed reps are going to be out there, and someone hands you an instrument, says this trumpet doesn't play.
Hmm.
You know, so just there are certain basic things they ought to know about, like how to put in valves,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. If you're an ed rep and you're not a brass player, what I would recommend is I would get with a brass player, have them take apart the instrument completely, and then show you how to put it together properly. Half the time, when I was a rep, someone would say this horn doesn't play. I'd pull out the three valves, make sure that everything was aligned the way it was supposed to be, hand it back to them, and the thing played fine. It didn't need to go to a
Mm.
repair shop.
So the valves were all mixed up or
Just
turned
turned
around?
around. Just have one valve
Mm.
turned around backwards, and all of a sudden it's literally like blowing into a wall.
Right, right. Sounds like something your repair shop could show ed reps how to do real quick.
Absolutely. That, or if you've got an instrument specialist in the store, who plays that instrument.
Ah, yeah.
I know, for me, when I was an ed rep, there were certain things that I couldn't do. Trumpets were no problem. Trombones were no problem. If somebody had a French horn valve that was out of phase, that was coming back to the shop with me. That wasn't something I was
Yeah,
comfortable
yeah.
with.
Trumpets are pretty simple, though. It's a good
They
point
are.
to learn how to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
usually it's either the valves, or the other thing to look for is a water key cork. If you've got a horn
Mm,
that plays like it's leaking, a lot of times it is. It just means the cork's not sealing that hole.
yeah. Simple to fix, right?
Simple fix. Yep.
Yeah. Hmm.
I don't know
I was
why
just
that
thinking
came to
about
me,
the
but
yeah, no, it's important. Yeah. I was just thinking about the sixth grade kid who's the future engineer who takes his trumpet completely apart and puts the valves in the wrong casings, and so it's good to be able to identify the number on the valve casing or on the valve itself to make sure you put it in the right slot.
right.
Seen that so many
And then
times.
whether it should face forward or backward, depending on the brand,
Yeah.
that's another thing.
Right.
And yeah, you've got the future engineers. The worst is the future engineer's dad decides that he's gonna
Ah,
he's gonna try to fix it. So I've seen.
no pliers. Please keep the pliers away from the
Yeah,
trumpets.
my favorite thing is you'll see somebody walking in the store with a trumpet that's like half closed on one side with a mouthpiece sticking out.
Oh yeah.
They're like, I was like, let me guess. I know why you're
Mm-hmm.
here.
Yeah.
So ed reps,
Yep.
that's something they should always have with them, is like a Bobcat mouthpiece puller or something like that.
Great
If
point.
you're ever looking for a gift to a band director, they don't have one of those. Everybody should have one of those. It's going to save a trip to the repair shop.
Yeah. It's so simple too.
Sure,
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Anything else?
not that I can think of.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Josh, and we appreciate your time and enjoy the beautiful weather out there in Phoenix.
We will have beautiful weather for another month, and then it gets hot. But yeah, thanks very much for having me. I was honored that you asked.
Thanks, Josh. We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.